Welcome to another podcast. I'm Emery Long with Catholic International University, and I'm here with Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News, a senior fellow of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and an esteemed faculty member of ours. Welcome, Dr. Bunson.
Great to be with you. And for today's purposes, the most important part, the faculty member.
Yes. No, we're so thankful to have you. You've been a part of Catholic International University since the Catholic Distance University days and done a lot of great work. And we just really want to get to know you a little bit better today. And so I'd love to hear, you've really immersed your life, as I discussed in the introduction, you've immersed your life in Catholic theology. And so, what drew you to that level of immersion?
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate because both of my parents were converts. My dad from Judaism, my mom from the Episcopalians. My dad grew up in the Boston area, my mom in Chicago, and they both converted in 1948 along very different paths, but didn't meet until 1960.
Okay.
And then they were married, and my brother arrived, and then I arrived, and we traveled around the world. But I think one of the advantages about being raised in a family of converts is that they chose the faith, that they were drawn to the faith. And I also had the great privilege and benefit of literally growing up in a chancery office in the Diocese of Honolulu. I grew up in Hawaii and surrounded then by all of these books. And even as a little kid, I began reading these books. Couldn't fathom most of what was in them, but as you get older and you're more familiar. And because my mother worked for the Diocese of Honolulu, Bishop John Scanlon, the late Bishop John Scanlon, she was also very conversant in the faith. And so not only did we go to Mass and immerse ourselves, live in the Catholic faith in Hawaii, but also there was a certain intellectual dimension to it too. So in that sense, I had the best of both worlds.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I completely agree with you. That added aspect of dialoguing and being interested in those conversations about the faith, I think, are so important for development. That's beautiful.
Yeah, and in my dad's case, he was somebody who converted because of the example of chaplains. He was in the military for 28 years, retired out, and when he joined, prior to his conversion, this is in World War II, right after Pearl Harbor, and then fought his way across Europe. And he was told from the beginning of his time in the military that if you have a real problem, yes, go to the chaplains, but go to the Catholics.
Wow.
And he asked, why the Catholics? They said because they're the ones who can deal with every issue and you can trust them.
Wow.
And so he had this relationship with a number of chaplains, and it was their example that brought him into the Catholic faith in 1948.
Wow, that's so beautiful and so true. I think we'll discuss a little bit more of where that comes from, right? How do Catholics know the truth, right? But I'm interested to hear more about. So you were raised in this beautiful family, and immersed yourself in the faith that way, and then I assume as an adult, you then went to study and receive an education in theology as well.
So it's again sort of a twofold aspect. Where I was blessed to be able to study the faith. And then also I became a writer very early on. I was very fortunate because a lot of people never have a chance to. I sold my first book when I was 22.
Wow.
And it was an encyclopedia of the Roman Empire. And it had the virtue of having never been done. So
wow.
A book like that simply didn't exist. So the publisher Facts on File, this is back in the 90s, early 90s. Saw this as a very interesting type of a project right at the time when they were starting a line of them. So that led to further writing. And so the study side and then the writing side came together. And then over the years, to be able to work on things like the Encyclopedia of Catholic History, the Encyclopedia of Saints. I worked with Dr. Scott Hahn on the Catholic Bible Dictionary.
Wow.
I was one of the early drafters of it. And what I found, too, is that working with an eminent scholar like Scott Hahn was worth as much as the dozen or so scripture courses I've probably had over the years, because it's the reality of doing, but also seeing how all of that fits together And then the added dimension of getting into Catholic journalism at the time back in the day with our Sunday Visitor. And then being able to cover things like the 2005 conclave, the 2013 conclave, reporting on the life of the church. So all of these different dimensions, but you realize very early on that all of it fits together. There is this beautiful need for integration if you're going to do it right. And then come to an understanding of what it means even to be a Catholic journalist and the idea of redemptive journalism, that everything that you write, whether it's an encyclopedia on that side or as a Catholic journalist, has to, at the end of the day, you're going to encounter people through these writings, or people are going to encounter you. And then are you fostering that additional encounter with Jesus Christ?
Wow. There's so much there that I think is so beautiful. What I heard you say there, you discussed in order to become proficient at something, you should do it, right? So that's amazing. And then also, as you said, but not neglecting yourself and your own devotion, right? I think that's something that both of those things I believe that theologians can find themselves in, which is number one, maybe immersing themselves in the study without acting and propelling forward the church and the teachings of the church. But then also, as you said, maybe getting too caught up in the study without encountering the person. So maybe talk a little bit more about that.
I'm a big believer in, it's usually attributed to St. John Chrysostom, who said that the road to hell is paved with the skulls of theologians.
Wow.
Now, he had withering criticisms for a lot of people. In his mind, justified, and I think he's referring to one of the great traps that we can fall into. The academic study of almost anything can itself become an end in itself. And certainly we have seen with the explorations of theologians over the centuries that they can be caught up in areas that become dry, that become merely academic exercises, and they lose sight of what it's supposed to do, which is to deepen their understanding of the faith, then to bring that deepened understanding to other people, to train others in that. But also that it remains simply for them this academic exercise, that it does not actually touch their heart. I think here we are just shortly removed from the announcement of the 38th Doctor of the Church, John Henry Newman. What is so remarkable about him, and I think why he's such a great role model for theologians, especially today, is he had this great academic desire to study the history of the church. But then he concluded, rightly so, that to study the history of the church is to cease to be Protestant.
Yes, I agree.
To delve into that past means you can't be Protestant. That was all beautifully academic. And the whole Oxford movement, this great academic adventure of trying to get to the roots of the Anglican Church and then having the intellectual honesty of realizing where it was taking them. But what was Newman's motto? Cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaking to heart. That for him, this remarkable theological journey culminated with a deepening relationship with Jesus Christ that led him to the truth of the Catholic faith. Why? Because he had to be honest. He had to have that integrity as a scholar, but also as a believer, and to turn to Christ, to turn to the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. So to be a theologian is also to pray that what you do as a theologian, and I don't consider myself a theologian in the great sense of the great history of theologians, but to be somebody who studies the teachings of the church in any academic sense really should be done on your knees in prayer. Because to deny that as an aspect of it is to be not just short-sighted, but ultimately to rob yourself of the deeper meaning of it.
Yes, I agree. It's almost like not seeing the forest through the trees, right? I think in every profession, and particularly this one, you should look back to your why. Why did you give your life to this, in the first place? And if the answer is because I wanted to, like you said, immerse myself in the academics, that's beautiful. But ultimately, you're studying a person. You're studying what is true and good and beautiful. And ultimately, that is our end, is to immerse ourselves in that. So
Yeah.
that's beautiful. Another piece of your work that I'm so interested in is your journalistic background. You're currently the editorial director at EWTN News. Previously, we had a discussion with Father Avelino on dialogue and dialogue from a Catholic social teaching perspective. Your role, I believe, is so unique in that you are delivering the news and delivering communications on the current state of affairs, but you're a Catholic, and so I'd love to hear how you manage all of that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to look back over the years in hopefully developing skills from the standpoint of Catholic journalism, but also to come to that realization that as we were talking a little while ago, that any piece that you write has to have two key aspects as a Catholic journalist. There is the highest possible standards of journalistic excellence to the best of your ability as a journalist. That means solid reporting. That means accurate and fair reporting. That means sourcing, everything that goes into being a reporter, a journalist, an editor. But then there's that Catholic dimension, the recognition that in any given story that you're going to write, there is a Catholic perspective. So from our standpoint, it's news from a Catholic perspective, but it's also news through the lens of Catholic teaching. Perfect example would be the IVF controversy of the last few years, starting, I think, in Alabama, where you had that particular case, and then suddenly it was the hot topic of conversation. From our standing, from our perspective, any story that we did on the IVF coverage had to do two things, to go back to those basics. What is this story about? What is at play here in terms of IVF? Answering to the question, what is IVF? But then including in any article that we do, any of our reporting, whether it's television, whether it's digital, whether it's print, what does the church teach about IVF? Why is the church opposed to it? And so anyone who comes to us, and we know that a lot of people do, who are looking for information on this, who are wondering, well, why does the church oppose this? It's in that one piece. So that's sort of emblematic, even what we call redemptive journalism, where whatever we do, we have a responsibility to be good, excellent journalists, but also at the same time to recognize that people's souls are in this equation too, and that we want to bring them ultimately to Jesus Christ. And we're unashamed, unabashed in how we approach things. The question is often asked of reporters, journalists, and editors in Catholic media, Catholic newspapers and elsewhere. Are you a Catholic or are you a journalist?
Wow.
And which comes first, or is there an order? Sometimes even seasoned Catholic reporters will say, well, I'm a journalist who happens to be Catholic. The issue with that, to my mind, is that you are sacrificing in some ways the unique role and opportunity and obligation that you have if you're writing or working for Catholic media, recognizing that phrase that is often used, that privileged place of serving the Catholic media environment in a very challenging era, and living your life as a Catholic who is a journalist, and using then the faith to guide what you write. They're not mutually exclusive. You can be a gifted, talented journalist, bringing all of the skills to bear of journalism, but at the same time being faithful to the teachings of the church and helping to form and inform your audience.
That's a beautiful balance that you're striking there, because you're not controlling the narrative in order to, sway somebody to your ideas, but rather you are expressing the narrative as it is, while also, like you said, expressing what the church teaches, which many people don't know, you know, and they might be turning to you, you know, if you hadn't added that piece in there, but okay, this is what the church teaches on IVF, they might be left wondering,
Exactly.
you know, so I think that's really beautiful.
Right. And people are coming to us in increasing numbers. We know by our traffic. A good example was the recent conclave. I mean, how often in your life are you going to be able to cover a papal election, interregnum, to say farewell to Francis? I covered him for 12 years. I had the joy of being the author of the first English language biography on Pope Francis in 2013. So it was a journey. And you get to know him a little bit, and you grow immensely fond of him, and then to say farewell. But then the whole of the Sede Vacante, the interregnum, to cover that, people were coming to us at EWTN for our coverage, our television coverage. For the day where we had the white smoke, Habemos Papam, we had over 3 million views just on YouTube.
I was one of them.
Thank you for that. But we also realized that, yes, it's 3 million views, but it's actually far more than that because classrooms were tuning in, groups were tuning in, all sorts of people were tuning in. So the numbers were exponentially higher. That brings, and this is one of the other key things, a certain responsibility in not just how we cover it, but in our whole approach to what we're offering to the audience. So that means commentary and reporting that helps people to have, I use the phrase a bunch of times, it was a journey. For the church, it was a journey. For Catholics, it was a journey for the world. And people all over the world were tuning in to watch what was happening in Rome. And at one point, the white smoke on the day that he was elected on May 8th came as a surprise to a lot of people. We can get into the details, but we assumed that they had done their vote for the afternoon and were now moving to the fifth vote. Turns out there was a delay, and that's why the white smoke took longer to come through the chimney. So we all had this sudden realization, white smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah, gangfumata. And I made the observation that the very same networks that were sort of surrounding us in their different sets, who had assured everyone that the Catholic Church was irrelevant, that no one really cares anymore. All of them were desperately scrambling to get on the air to report that Habemos Papam, the church has a new pope. And they dedicated millions and millions of dollars of what are increasingly really tight budgets for news outlets to cover this. There were, at any given time, probably around 4,000 journalists accredited as OEC during those days. So not only does it matter who's pope, but there's something very deeply embedded in the mind of non-Catholics, of Catholics, that something important is happening here. And so from our standpoint, we're covering that with a very keen awareness and completely forthright embrace of the fact, yeah, we know this is really important, and here's why. So it's always the answering, especially where the Catholic teaching is concerned, the why of why the church does things and why this should matter to you.
Wow, that's a beautiful observation. I've observed that myself in my own life. Much of my family are non-Catholics, and every single one of them knew about the conclave. They knew about the white smoke. They knew we had an American pope, and it was exciting. And I think that's a beautiful thing. When they ask you, why should I care about this? What is your answer?
Well, for two reasons. There's the reality that it matters who's pope, that this is a global figure. This is somebody, as we have seen, especially in the last 100 years, that the popes are very key figures on the global scene. Yes, people can dismiss the Pope as just the head of the Catholic Church, and what does that mean? But actually, as we saw, for example, one perfect example of what I mean, in 2020, in March of 2020, as the COVID pandemic gripped the world and the world shut down, Pope Francis made the decision to do an Urbi et Orbi in St. Peter's Square, And he stood there seemingly alone, carrying the anxiety, the fear, and the loneliness of the world on his shoulders. And he walked through the square in the rain. And then what did he do? He held up the monstrance for the world to see. And he had this beautiful reflection on the boat in the storm with our Lord. And the world was riveted by this. And it came at a moment of such severe anxiety for the world, to use that word again, that it was kind of a psychological, emotional, and I would argue spiritual turning point for a lot of people. That over the next months, as the reality of the shutdown continued, that a lot of people look back on that moment. So right there you have why the popes matter. But then, this is also somebody who is the spiritual head of 1.6 billion Catholics, but also the spokesperson, as we see, for everyone of goodwill around the world. He is the voice of the conscience of the world. And that's something, too, that they recognize. But it's also something that we realize that they try to dismiss, they try to ignore, and it has never succeeded and never will, precisely because he is the vicar of Christ. He is a successor of Peter.
Mm. That's so beautiful. Were you anticipating Pope Leo? Robert Prevost, were you anticipating that he would become Pope?
Well, looking back, obviously we all had our lists of the papabili, as they say. And his name was not particularly circulating in the days leading right up to the conclave. But when I landed in Rome on April 22nd, so the day after Pope Francis died, so he passed away on the 21st, and one of my jobs is to hop on a plane and get there as soon as possible. And I was talking to a lot of the experts in Rome and people that I know and contacts and sources and all of that and friends. And I would go through the list, who are you hearing? Because that's what you do. And I said, well, what about this Prevost, Cardinal Prevost? Because his name would come up. And they would all say the same thing, essentially. That, yes, given his background, he's an expert in canon law, he's a great Augustinian, eminently qualified to be Pope. And they would all say the same thing. But we know he won't because he's an American.
Right.
But by just a few days before the conclave, the question that I was asking my friends is, what if there were enough cardinals who decided that doesn't really matter, that they're willing to look past that? And then we know, looking back, that because of his time in the mission fields of Peru, because of his time as the head of the Augustinians, he'd been away from the United States for a very long time. He was, I think, as one American cardinal put it, really more of a citizen of the world than he was a U.S. citizen. That one other way of putting it was he was probably the least American, the Americans that they could possibly elect. And it's true. He's absolutely American. We know he's a White Sox fan, loves deep dish, from Chicago. But he's also somebody who has such vast experience as a missionary, as a member of the Augustinians, and then as the prefect for the dicastery for bishops. So he has this great awareness of the universal church. And I think that was one of the things that drew the cardinals to him. But the other aspect, and this goes back, I think, to his temperament as a missionary, but also as a member of the Augustinians, and who he is. His temperament is of someone who listens, who assesses, who acts with great prudence before he makes a decision. And I think that's something that really drew a lot of the cardinals who had gotten to know him very quietly. And I think it's ultimately why they elected him. Wow. But it still came as a surprise to everyone when the name was announced.
Right, I'm sure. I mean, as someone who was covering it, I mean, what were you feeling in that moment?
Well, when it was Cardinal Dominique Mamberti, who was the senior cardinal, the proto-deacon, came out and announced Habemus Papam Annuncio Vobis Gaudium Magnum, and then he says Robertum. We all joked that we were studying all the names in accusative in Latin, because that's what it is. Robertum. There was a flash for a second, and I thought, well, a lot of people were praying for the election of Robert Sara because he's a beloved figure. But within a nanosecond, I realized it was Cardinal Prevost.
Wow, so beautiful.
Yeah.
As you said before, the Pope is a voice of the conscience of, how the church is moving forward, how the world should move forward. What, there's no better way to put it. What does God have in mind for Cardinal Prevost, for Pope Leo the 14th?
Well, I think as with any pope, he has assumed the office. He was chosen by his fellow cardinals. It's a juridical act. And yet it is very clear that there was providence at work here, and we believe that. We know that he is aided. He's not left alone in the government of the church. And in this particular case, I think he is somebody who also can lean in to that great Augustinian tradition. And that means something in the sense of he is, as he himself says, a son of Augustine. And history has always proven that we have the popes, we have the saints, we have the leaders in the church who are needed in this particular moment in history. Anyone who doubts that can just look back to 1978 in the election of Pope St. John Paul II. We had John Paul I who survived 33 days and was taken from us, and succeeded then by the unimaginable, the first non-Italian in over 400 years, who proved a colossus, who for good reason is already called the Great, who I hope and suspect at some point in the future will be declared a doctor of the church, who was needed at that moment from different directions, from the standpoint of guiding our understanding and implementation of the Second Vatican Council in a way that is truly authentic to the Council, who understood the challenges of the time, of the great upheavals that were taking place, who was himself clearly a saint, who also was going to be a prophetic witness to the world. By the end of his pontificate, he was warning the world about the risks to the human person. We see that in Evangelium Vitae. We see that in Veritatis Splendor. We see that in so many of his writings, warning the world about those threats. And now, 20 years after his passing, we see that he was correct. That not only are there threats to the human person, but now we have reached the point where it's almost impossible or difficult to define what a person is. And had we listened, and this is one of the great legacy of the popes, had we listened to John Paul II back in the day, and to Benedict XVI, and to Pope Francis, we would be in a very different place than we are right now in culture.
Right.
So from that standpoint, I think Robert Francis Cardinal Prevost, as Leo XIV, is the person who is perfectly suited, who is the one who can be this source of unity in the life of the church, but also to have that prophetic witness. We're already starting to see that in his pontificate with his concerns about AI, with his concerns about the family, with his stress on the natural law and a proper understanding of the family in the modern world. So I think the energy that he's already bringing, the way that he's already connecting to youth, there has been in him a certain serenity, and his transition has been so smooth. It feels as though he's been Pope for many, many years, even though it was only on February 14th that Pope Francis went into the hospital. It's been that journey for all of us, but I think we are where God wants us to be.
I completely agree. I think, speaking for my generation a little bit, we all feel a bit of worry. Where's the world going?
Yeah.
As you said, how is the human person being upheld? And not that anyone would articulate it that way necessarily in my generation, but we feel it. And especially when we're talking about technology and prudence around AI. And so I believe he really is speaking to the younger generations and the older generations as well, just addressing these concerns and these worries.
Yeah, and I think, the assumption is that his first encyclical this is an assumption, it's always a dangerous thing to do, will be something on AI. He has talked about it. He sees himself very much as a successor to Leo the 13th, with Rerum Novarum addressing the great technological industrial revolution and its impact on life and culture. But also, I think he sees the necessity for us, and this is what I find so interesting about him. We can't be afraid of the technologies. And this goes back to things like social communications, whereas the Second Vatican Council tells us in that great and somewhat forgotten document, Inter Mirifica, that we are called to utilize all the means of communications, so all the means at our disposal. But it requires us to be proficient at it, but also to use it wisely. And I think that's one of the things that Pope Leo has already been talking about. Don't be afraid of social media. Don't be afraid of these technological innovations and even revolutions. Use them, but use them prudently. In the great tradition of the church, that St. Paul used sandals, used vellum, he used parchment to write his letters. He used his voice. He used classic forms of rhetoric to speak to a pagan world that could understand innately what he was doing, rooted in things like Aristotle and the communication for that. But then you can see in each generation, in each century, how the church has utilized those means of social communications, from illuminated manuscripts to stained glass windows as the Bible for the illiterate, to those beautiful little pamphlets that Francis de Sales created and would have a legion of followers who would slide them under the doors of Protestants, inviting them to come back to the church. All of these dimensions culminating, especially in the 20th century, with the recognition of the new media, film, television, print, radio. All of them are at our disposal, but all of them have to be used with wisdom, with care, but also with great professionalism. That side, the secular side, has seemingly unlimited amounts of money. We have limited resources. So it's necessary then for us to be great stewards of the resources that we have, to use them wisely. But it helps that we also have truth on our side.
That's a beautiful perspective. That is an ongoing conversation on, how do we use social media wisely? And, many young people are seeing people do it wrong. They're seeing some people do it right. But I on a practical level, I'd love to know your advice for those that, really desire to communicate the truth through these means, but don't know where to start in beginning to learn that professionalism that you speak of.
Well, part of it is mastering the craft and being attuned to the changes in it. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when MySpace, for example, no one remembers MySpace. I don't think I ever had a page on MySpace because I was too old. But now we're seeing the evolution of it, but it's also being attuned to those changes. And that's a byproduct, too, of being what the classic phrase now, a digital native, that virtual world, the digital reality, the digital continent, as Pope Benedict XVI famously said, recognizing that this is where you live, but it's also mission territory, that we are called to evangelize this space, but then also to having a very sober understanding of that how you live your faith also has to be lived in that way in the social space, in your social media space too. Obviously, if you spend a lot of time on X, it can be a rather unpleasant place. But at the same time, it's also one of those great means for reaching people, for building those relationships. Instagram is another one. TikTok, obviously, is another one. And I know that other platforms are all developing. Understanding that just as it is in the real world, how you behave, what you say, and how you live your faith can impact the people around you exactly the same way with social media. That what you post, how you post it, and you can always ask yourself a question. that somebody who's going to read this post or watch my reel on Instagram or TikTok. I notice I don't say Facebook because I know that that's the younger generation I don't think uses much Facebook yet. But on these platforms and other ones, you could probably tell me which other the newest platforms.
Yeah, go ahead.
But that your presence on these platforms and how you comport yourself, what you say matters. And if at first it seems like no one's paying attention to you, people will find you, and like-minded people will find you. And so you're building these networks. You don't have to sacrifice who you are in the mistaken belief that you can build an audience. And I think one of the mistakes that has been made by some over these last decades is this idea that if we watered down the teachings of the church, that somehow people will be less afraid, or they're going to like us a little bit more, or they might come to us. In fact, the opposite, we know, is usually the case. That the more you water down the faith, the more you compromise in what you're saying. It doesn't mean that you're intolerant. It doesn't mean that you're hostile. I think it's what Pope Francis meant when he referred to proselytism as such solemn nonsense, is how he put it. It's, are we attracting people? Are we drawing people to us by living the faith authentically and joyfully and in a winsome, inviting way? I think that does translate well into social media. But it also, you can ask yourself the question, does anyone who watches my reel, are they edified? Are they a better person for seeing it? And ultimately, am I making it possible for them to answer the big questions that we know everyone is asking in their lives? And at the end of the day, are they being taken a few steps closer to having that direct encounter with Christ?
Wow, that's beautiful. As you're speaking, I believe you're describing a problem that we're seeing, actually, right? Of course you are, but on LinkedIn is one of those old new social medias that's up and coming, but has been around for a little while. And I saw a post on X recently where somebody said, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way people communicate on LinkedIn. And that really spoke to what I was feeling. And I think it's what you're describing, which is it's not human. It's not true to, and I'm not saying that's everybody on LinkedIn, of course, but I do think there is, it's popular to act like you have it all together, right? And that's not the human experience. But I do think there's a balance, right? We also don't want to be complaining on social media. So there's some kind of balance there in between being a human being who, as you said, is expressing who they are and the way that they're striving for what is true and good.
Right.
But also we don't want to get too focused on the woes of life, right?
Yeah. And it's, part of it is, it's very performative in so many ways. People play out every drama. I remember, and this dates me, but I can remember going back when I first joined Facebook, like 1,000 years ago, and I couldn't quite figure out what the point of it was. Mm-hmm. And I started off with probably the worst possible experience, because somebody actually posted they posted, "I'm flossing," and I thought, okay, I'm not a better person for knowing this, but I began to understand that this is where people now were also living, and they were reaching out. And I mean, there have been a lot of studies on fragmentation, social disintegration, as a result, in part, of social media, of this digital reality, because there is this blurring of the lines that we're not communicating very well. And at a time when you can be relatively anonymous and have absolutely horrendous behavior, seemingly without any consequences, but then also the inability to communicate fully yourself, to be an authentic person in that environment, contributes, I think, to that sense of isolation. It's why we have so many ways of communicating with each other now. But we're terrible at speaking.
Right. Yeah, as you were saying, as you spoke about the person who posted "I'm flossing," it's funny, but when you really look at it, it's like that person wants to be seen. That's why they're posting that, and it's heartbreaking that that is the way they're going about it.
Yeah, and people will live their lives completely on Instagram,
Hmm.
on TikTok, and is their life full?
Hmm.
Are they living as they're called to live? And I'm not judging them. What I'm saying is that what does their life actually look like? And are they by themselves? Or I mean, are they actually living in community? And that's part two, I think, of what the church can offer, that there is this community. And it's community rooted in the sacraments, it's community rooted in Christ.
That's beautiful. A theme that I'm feeling in this conversation, there's a quote, I forget who it's by, but it's wherever you go, there you are. And I think that really speaks to even the online space is that, if you are not fully forming yourself and seeking out what is true and good and beautiful in your real life, you're not going to be able to perform well online and pretend like you are, right? Or seek out that community online in a way that's healthy.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also we can seriously underestimate the how passing this is.
Hmm.
Platforms are going to be coming and going. The recent challenges with TikTok was the source, I know, of deep anxiety
Yep.
for a lot of people
Yep.
who have the illusion, well, I have 2 million followers. But what does it actually mean? And yes, you might be able to commodify this. You might be able to make money doing this. But what does that actually mean in the long run?
Right.
And these platforms could disappear tomorrow.
Hmm. Another concern that my generation is facing is a sense of major tribalism going on social media. You mentioned X before, right?
Right.
Where does that come from, and how can we get away from it?
I think we have seen the triumph in some ways of Saul Alinsky, the idea that everything is political, and it is. And in some ways, it's frustrating from a Catholic standpoint because you can see the polarization and the politicization of parts of the church. It's the source of, is a great sadness. I think one of the things that Pope Leo has taken on for himself as Pope is this idea of unity
Mm-hmm.
in the faith, that we do not belong to any political party as Catholics. You may be a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but as a Catholic, you belong to the church. And from that standpoint, where how you vote as a Catholic, for example, should be confounding to both political parties, because there's always going to be something that separates you from each of the parties. There's that famous phrase that if the church becomes the bride of one age, she shall be a widow in the next. And historically, that has been one of the things that the church has always resisted, but to her great suffering and persecution, because the age demands a certain conformity. And when we see this level of polarization, it says in some ways that we have lost focus on who we are as Catholics. For example, any pope looking at any administration in any country is going to have areas of agreement and areas of strong disagreement. The only thing that varies is who those political leaders are.
Mm-hmm.
When John Paul II and the Bush family, both George H.W. Bush and then George W. Bush, there were areas of great agreement in fighting things like the Soviet Union, the atheistic communism. But we also saw, and the area of pro-life, but we also saw very strong disagreements on the part of John Paul II with George W. over the Iraq War. Similarly, with the Clinton administration, with the Biden administration, we saw areas of common ground, certainly in the area of things like the death penalty, on efforts to improve healthcare, whatever one thinks of, like the Affordable Care Act, that sort of thing. But also immensely strong disagreement on the area of life, on abortion and things like gender ideology. It's the same thing with the Trump administration. As a Catholic, as you form your conscience in how to vote, being aware of the teachings of the church actually is an absolutely essential guide, not just to your life, but also how you're going to make these decisions as a voter, but then also how you're going to engage in public discourse. Mm-hmm. To bring the teachings of the church, the values, to put it in those terms, of the church into public discourse, into the public square, but then also being willing to fight very strongly in terms of the law and constitutional rights, our right to be heard in the public square. When we talk about social media, one of the things that we're seeing quite a bit of is this effort to either silence or to push believers out of public discourse. This idea of the separation of church and state in the Constitution, all of that, how they choose to interpret it is no religion at all. And it goes back to the idea of the freedom of religion that is often defined as a freedom of worship, which is something very distinctly different. And as Catholics, we need to be aware of that when we talk about the freedom of worship, what they're basically telling us is, yes, you can worship in your churches, but do not speak of it once you walk out the doors into the world. And so from a Catholic ethos, everything is of interest to the church. Everything. And the church has wisdom on everything. And how we lead our lives, how we can be happy. But then also how, again, we form our consciences. And one thing, for example, like with EWTN News, we never tell anyone how to vote. And for obvious reasons, legally. But also, our goal is to help people form their consciences as they prepare to vote. And that's why we have things like voter guides, where this is what the church teaches on things like immigration and the death penalty and abortion and gender ideology. So that as a Catholic living in this hyper-polarized political world, you can see that we can't conform to any party. We are transcendent. But at the same time, we have to live in the world and bring those teachings to the world. That's been the focus of popes, like before he became Pope, Joseph Ratzinger, in Catholics and political life. How does that work exactly? Well, it works because you are bringing those values, but you also have to have the courage to tell people, no, you can't tell me that I can't bring these values. And your values are formed by something too. It might be secular materialism. It might be radical socialism. Those are your values. We believe that we have the right and the obligation to proclaim ours in culture as well. And I think that's the more that you conform yourself as a Catholic, the more you begin to realize that this level of polarization is a mirage, that it is a trap that can lead to the tribalism that you were just talking about.
I think that's exactly right. And praise God that we are able to tether ourselves to eternal truths, right? Because as you say, political parties will always fail us. And if you tie your identity to that would be heartbreaking for you. And so I think that's a great reminder to be weary of that. And then I think that's also a great reminder, as you said, to have the courage to say, no, I am a Catholic. And that is where my values were formed. And I do believe that it is true. Because we can't lose that in public discourse.
But also we have to have the capacity to articulate what we believe.
True.
And to recognize, too, that there will be those who will try to misrepresent Catholic teaching. There was a famous politician who some years back tried to argue that Aquinas and Augustine were actually in favor of abortion. We know that's simply not the case. Any reading at all that's faithful, that is honest, would tell you, no, that's not the case. Now you can get into the whole scientific arguments and all of that, but the reality is that the church has never wavered in her opposition to abortion. just read the Didache, just read all of the church fathers, all the way to the modern era. Pope Francis had some of the strongest condemnations of abortion of any of the modern popes. And I mean that seriously, how he approached that question. So there is this unbroken chain of church teaching. It's perennial and it's unbending. Why? Because it has to be. But you will encounter people who will try, even some organizations who claim to be Catholic, who will advance an agenda that is very clearly in direct contradiction of the teachings of the church. But we have an obligation as Catholics to be formed enough, or to go to places where you can be formed enough, where you know the truth, but at the same time you can then articulate it. And that requires a lot of effort. It requires a choice to study, to be formed, but it's the best thing you can do for yourself.
I completely agree. I have a bachelor's in theology, and although I don't work in theology, it has formed the way that I approach the world and the way that I approach every job I've ever had. And I've been blessed by it. What do you recommend? How can we go about forming ourselves in the faith if we've not done so already?
Well, we've been talking a lot about social media and the whole digital world.
Yes.
In some ways, we are more blessed today, more fortunate today, given the resources that are out there. If you go online and you begin searching for ways to study church teaching, they're out there. So they're right in front of you. They're at your fingertips. It's just a question of exercising a certain judgment and prudence of your sources. And one of the things that I love about Catholic International is that as a great friend of Catholic International, Dr. Robert Royal, who used to teach for us, he always said the thing that he loved about Catholic Distance University back in the day was that he said, we're just Catholic.
Yeah.
We're Catholic. And from that standpoint, finding an institution like Catholic International where you have so ready access to what the church teaches, but also having that taught by professors, scholars who can form you, who are themselves devoted to the teachings of the church, who love what they do. That's one thing. Then when you begin to look at other online resources, I think, for example, EWTN, where you have a vast amount of content. And then you can get into all of the other organizations that are out there that can help form you. Bishop Robert Barron, for example, is this household name among so many Catholics who can guide you. And then the very simple thing of following what the Pope is doing on a daily basis. It's really not that difficult. And in social media, he's everywhere. He has, 18 million followers on X after about 24 hours or whatever it was. So turning to him is also a perfect example. And that will then lead you into other sources that he references, studying scripture, picking up the catechism. We're reading the catechism online. It's actually a great book, just on its own merits. It's a fascinating journey to take. So in many ways, there's no real excuse not to find these great resources that will help form you. And I also always very strongly recommend studying the lives of the saints. And the thing I love about studying the lives of the saints is that you will come across a saint that surprises you. That it's like forming an unexpected friendship with somebody. My late mom, when she was a little girl growing up in Chicago, she wasn't even Catholic yet, but she was fascinated by the story of Damien of Mologai, the leper priest. This idea of somebody going all the way to the Pacific to serve and then dying of leprosy, caring for lepers. He wasn't a very well-known figure in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s. But she had this great fascination with him. And sure enough, the day came where we ended up living in Hawaii. And she was very active in promoting the cause for his canonization. And I had the great privilege, I think it was in 2008, of attending his canonization in Rome. And for me, it was like going to the graduation of a friend. those are the friendships that you can have with the saints, and the saints will find you in just weird ways, in delightful ways. And studying their lives will lead you to the study of other saints, to find out how in your own life there's something about a saint that just connects with you, and using them as role models in times of difficulty, but also times of joy. So the lives of the saints, it's a great way to deepen your faith and to embrace it.
That's beautiful. You had mentioned before to find those to form you, those that love their faith, right? That love what they do, and I can confidently say that's something you exhibit. You've written 59 books.
By the end of the year, I think, yeah.
Yes. So tell me about that. How is that possible to write that many books? And tell me about some of your favorites.
Boy, I always joke that I go for quantity over quality. But, also my number pales in comparison to one of my great friends, Mike Aquilina. I think he's pushing 70 some books. It's really, there's an old sports adage, I'd rather be lucky than good. Now, there's some truth to that, because so much of a book idea is timing. Can you find a publisher that's interested in doing the book right now?
Okay.
Some books, you may have to wait a while. Some books never find their time. And in that sense, I think I've been very fortunate. It's also understanding that when you start a book, there are certain things that you have to grasp. What is the goal? Have realistic expectations. There's a certain discipline that you need, obviously. Yes. But also, is it something that you really want to write about? And is it something that you love doing? And I think all of those sort of come together where you feel not a compulsion, but it's something you feel like you have to do. And then being blessed to have the time to do it, the space to do it, the support around you to do it. I would encourage anyone to take up writing. Even if you don't end up getting published, you'll learn something about yourself. And you may learn something about the world, about your faith, especially if you're thinking about writing on the church, but also have sort of realistic expectations about it. And also read everything. Read great authors in the field that you want to write in. So if you want to write the great Catholic novel, Louis de Wohl and all of these others, read them. To understand the craft of fiction writing, which is something very different from nonfiction, which is even very different from like reference book writing. So you understand a little bit of who you are, and then understand who you want to write for, and then figure out the best ways to get there. And then there's just the craft, the challenge of doing. And that, to be honest, that's one of the hardest parts. Getting started, and then just the doing of it.
Yeah, I think that circles back to something we said at the beginning, or something you had said, which is if you want to become great at something, you have to do it, right?
Right.
And I think that's so true. And tying that in with the social media generation, you might have a friend that has 60,000 followers. And so there's this fear of, well, what if nobody reads it? And I would encourage, and I believe you would too, you should do it anyways, because this forms you just as much as it may form somebody else, if not more.
Yeah, and you don't know who might show up at that particular moment to read that post. Maybe it could be a passage from Scripture. It could be some very alarming comment from St. John Chrysostom about theologians. But it might be something that somebody was meant to see in that moment. But it's also, I think there's always, to your point, I think, and it's a very wise one, I think there's a fear of sort of just shouting into the void.
Right.
That no one is there, which can, I think there's a fear of simply heightening your sense of isolation, of rejection even. And anyone who reads comments on any of their posts on Facebook or X or elsewhere, the comments, the trolls, I know there are a million terms now for what can happen to you. But at the same time, you can also find a very supportive community. You can meet friends. So there are so many upsides to it.
Absolutely.
But again, it's this mature awareness like with the world. You can't delude yourself about the challenges there. But if you're armoring yourself with the faith and you want to share that love of the faith, it's worth doing.
Absolutely. And I think that really speaks to what we discussed earlier, which is not forgetting the human aspects of, the emerging technologies and, the reality that we're not talking to followers, we're talking to human beings, and so, as you said, if one person stumbles across your piece and finds some value in it, that's worth something.
Yeah, it is. These are children of God. They're made in the image and likeness of God. These are human persons with an innate dignity, even though they don't necessarily act like that from time to time
right.
on social media. But you're right. And the digital reality isn't going away. It's going to be with us. We're going to watch it evolve. I'm old enough to remember a time when no one had any idea of what was coming.
Right.
They knew the computers were on the rise, but what does that mean for me as a person? Now we're seeing this evolution. AI has added an immense dimension to everything. Is it a passing fad? I don't think so. And neither do you, I think, as somebody who lives as a younger person in this reality. But what is this going to look like in 5 years? What is it going to look like in 10 or 15 years? Compared to where we were 5, 10, 15 years before, the pace of change is also happening so quickly. And that's something we need to be aware of too in our lives. But also because of technology, because of the reality of these developments, the pace of the growth of AI, that's where we need this wisdom to understand where it could be headed, but also then to bring to bear the wisdom of the church. Each step of the way, if you go back and you look, you can see that the popes, that great scholars, that great theologians have reflected, saints have reflected on the dangers of these technologies. But again, we keep coming back that as Catholics, we're not afraid of this technology. Leo XIII wasn't afraid of the Industrial Revolution. He saw it, but understood what was needed in that moment. John Paul II wasn't afraid of the technologies that were emerging at the end of the 20th century, but he was trying to warn the world about the ramifications of this technology.
Right.
In exactly the same way that here we are with AI, with the ramifications of this technology. And I think each step of the way, listen to the wisdom of the church. It works every time it's tried.
100% success rate.
Yes, exactly. The key is you got to try it.
Right. Well, this has been such a beautiful discussion. Thank you so much for your time here today. Thank you so much for all the work that you've done at Catholic International University amongst your other endeavors. I would encourage anybody at Catholic International or a future potential Catholic International student to take one of your courses. And once again, thank you.
It's a joy to be with you. Really was.
Thanks.
Thanks for everything.